last time at the end of the period we were talking about the topic of the sunset process, and how that's an interesting legislative process that's been put into place to ensure that state agencies are routinely subjected to oversight by the legislature. And if you remember, the sunset process is where every 12 years, right, the law is in place that every 12 years, an agency loses its legal status to exist and goes away. And that is only prevented if the legislature comes in and positively passes a law saying they're going to extend it. And if they've done their oversight process, their sunset process correctly, there's been a full review of that agency done, and a recommendation and a write-up of that agency by the Sunset Commission to the legislature, so that they can see that that agency is both still filling the necessary need, is doing the work it's supposed to do, and is spending its money appropriately, meeting its goals, that kind of thing. Along with that is usually a list of recommendations that the Sunset Commission finds that provides, a good path forward for the agency to, if they get a recommendation to continue, to do better, right, and to address things better. I don't think I talked too much about what happens when it's going the wrong way. I did mention, I think last time, that sometimes agencies are found to be duplicative, and they will recommend getting rid of an agency and shifting authority over to another one. At times, though, there have been agencies that are doing what their commissioners tell them to do, but not necessarily doing what the legislature expects them to do as far as implementing legislation, and they're given. Let me back up a little bit. In that 9-year period or 12-year period, at about year 9 is when the Sunset Commission does its review. And so in year 10, right, the legislature sees the review and has the ability to start looking at what's going on. And quite often, if an agency is doing bad, this is where they will tell them, we're going to shut you down at the next legislative session unless you start doing these things right. And then, so they have a 2-year window there to correct things and get better before year 12 comes along. And usually they'll give them 6 months to a year maybe to sort things out. And then they start planning about whether to get rid of an agency that's not doing its job, or to how to replace its leadership, or maybe how to pass new legislation. And what can happen is that, one, they cannot, when year 12 comes around, if they haven't done anything positive, the agency goes away. But two, usually you're seeing them make a decision in year 10, and they use that last year or so to wind the agency down, right, to stop it from, and so everybody at the agency knows their job is going away, right? So it's never really a surprise. I mean, this is a kind of a process that lays everything out in a very methodical way over this 12-year period, and it gives them more than enough time to do their job right, more than enough time to be reviewed adequately, and then to adjust. And then if they still don't do that, then the legislature can choose to not issue any kind of new legislation that would keep them around, and they will dissolve. That doesn't usually happen, right? This process works pretty well, and agencies usually respond to it. I remember a few years ago, the Railroad Commission, I was watching them in their testimony with the legislature as they were being reviewed by the Sunset Commission, and they received a really harsh review. And the legislature was asking the commissioners, right, what are you going to do about this? How are you going to respond to this? Why, moving forward, you need to fix this. And there was a lot of pushback by the railroad commissioners, because if you remember, that's one of the agencies where those folks are elected, right, by state elections. So those commissioners have a job, right, and are elected to fulfill that. And so the legislature has a hard time keeping check on them, but that doesn't mean they couldn't take away all of their funding and take away all of their positions and leave those commissioners with no agency to be in charge of. So, which would be a rather embarrassing thing to see happen. But the commissioners were pushing back, and the legislators were getting a little hot about it. And so it was kind of interesting to see them try to exert their oversight, and then these statewide elected officials trying to tell them, we really are doing what our constituents want and not what you want, because that's what we're elected to do. And there's this back and forth, and eventually the commission kind of, I think, from at least my interpretation of it, managed themselves to a position where they made the legislature happy. But so it's an interesting process for sure. And in those agencies that are not led by statewide elected officials, that's not even a possibility, right? I mean, it's even easier to exercise that oversight. All right, so that kind of closes out, I think, the sunset process. If there's any questions, I'll be happy, right, to hear anything about that if I wasn't clear on it or you want some clarification. If not, we'll move on to our next topic, which is bureaucracies as implementers, right? As the groups that implement legislation. That's their job, right? Their job for the bureaucracy is to take legislation that the legislature has passed, the governor has signed off on, and turn it into action, right? And the first step in doing that is coming up with a set of actual operational rules that say, okay, here's the law says do X. To do X, we're going to have to do steps 1 through 15 in this time frame with this many people, these kind of public meetings, and by the time we get here, right, we'll have a process in place and we can do what we're supposed to do. And you got to get everything organized and laid out, and then people, right, come to public meetings, and the legislature provides some oversight. The governor looks at things, and everybody kind of says, yes, that's the process. Let's move forward. And so their job then is on a day-to-day basis to do that work, right? To make sure that they've got the people in the right place and the right training and the right processes and right procedures, and implement the law. And that's the everyday challenge of the bureaucracy, is to take what comes out of the legislature and turn it into something more than words and legislation, and right, actually turn it into action. And sometimes that's a challenge. And so I'm not going to talk about bureaucracies as successful implementers, because when they do their job, nobody knows about them anyway. Just things are getting done. People are filling out paperwork and paying fees and service fees and things like that, and they're getting what they want out of government, and everybody's moving on. What I want to spend time talking about is the challenges that pop up while you're trying to implement legislation. And we have this myth and this consistent set of stories around the bureaucracy that it's not effective, it's not efficient, it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, that its employees are just lazy and not getting anything done, and it's a waste of time, money, and effort. And if you want to get something really messed up as bad as you can, give it to a bureaucrat, right? We hear these things all the time, right? These complaints and these perspectives of bureaucracy. And when you have those kind of complaints and those kind of perspectives, they're not usually made up, right? There's something that's there that's leading to those conclusions and leading to those long-term jokes and perspectives. And so what I want want to talk about are the challenges that bureaucracies face as they try to implement the law. And I like to do that from a perspective of looking at the failures of implementation, why things don't work, instead of spending time on telling you how they do work. So we're going to talk about the implementation failure of agencies and what leads to them. There are at least 6 different categories of implementation failure that we're going to talk about. We're going to move through each one of these one by one. So we'll do that on the slides, right? So the first one is really interesting, and it's implementation failure by bad program design. And by bad program design, I'm saying that what the legislature put into law and said, this is what needs to happen, this is the goal, we're passing this legislation to have this happen, is impossible. It can't be done. And a lot of people will look at you when you say something like that, and they'll go, well, they wouldn't pass legislation that couldn't be done. And I'm here to tell you that that's just absolutely not true. They quite often, right, have these ideas that if we just pass law X, miraculously, this thing will happen. But they don't, and it's not really their job a lot of times as legislators, to sit down and figure out if what they're asking is possible or not possible. So let me give you an example, and I say this with familiarity, right? You gun nuts are going to like this, and I'll just tell you right now that I'm a multiple gun owner, so you might call me a gun nut. But right. We have legislation after legislation after legislation that's being put into place to try to control what happens when bad people use guns the wrong way. And you cannot blame legislatures for looking at the horrendous results that happen in society when we see these mass shootings at schools and events, and you know, I mean, those are large societal ills, right? They are problems. And everybody, right, that's got any kind of lick of common sense would love to come up with a solution that allows people to have their guns that want them and society not to have to experience, right, these huge failings where we get just, you know, people killed from guns, because, you know, guns are inherently dangerous tool. There's no way around it. You misuse them just a little bit and the results can be catastrophic, and people know that, right? And the legislatures in all of the states and at the federal level, right, are always challenged by this issue, right? People go to the legislature with problems. And the legislature, right, has to try to take these problems on. I'm telling you that I can't think of a possible solution, right, to taking the inherent riskness out of guns, unless you do what most people don't want, and that would be just to outlaw guns, completely just confiscate all of them, and then deal with the criminals that still have theirs somehow, right? If we were to do that, and other countries have, we would have a lot fewer deaths by gun, right? We know that. We look at other countries that have done it, and that's their results. But they're not us. They don't have our history. They don't have our Constitution. They don't have our perspective of guns that we have as a nation. Now, certainly groups have different perspectives within the U.S. And so I'm not trying to make an argument for or against guns. That's not the point. The point I'm trying to make is that when a legislature, right, a state's legislature, Texas legislature, tries to deal with this issue, anything they pass is going to lead to policy failure. Is it possible that the Texas legislature would ever outlaw and confiscate guns? Not ever gonna happen in Texas, right? Our our makeup is who we are as Texans, we're not going to go there. Not that there aren't Texans that wouldn't. I'm just saying, as a state, the whole thing, that would be the least likely thing I could think of happening in the state. So the legislature, when it's looking at real things it can do, that's not really on its agenda. So it has to look at other ways. So how do we stop, right, people with guns going into churches and shooting people? How do we stop people going into theaters and with guns and shooting people? If ever, right, there's going to be a situation where you're going to fail when you pass legislation, when you take the option of removing guns completely away, I think you're going to fail at this one at some point. It's just going to happen, right? Bad people, lethal guns, dead people. I mean, it's almost logic, right? I mean, and so that's a tough thing. And when you talk to legislators about it, they know that everything they do, whether it's expanding rights to carry or to taking rights away, taking rights away, but curbing use and availability, none of it's going to actually really work, but they have to do something anyway. And when they do that, they pass that legislation on to an agency whose job is to make it work. And the agency's just looking at everybody going, really? Y'all couldn't really pass legislation that would work, and now you want us to sprinkle some fairy dust over the top and make it work? You've given us a solution here that we cannot really ever meet the goal. There's always going to be failure over and over and over again. And the agency that has to do that's going to be hated by the folks that want to have guns because they're seeing them as the government infiltrating on their, stepping on their rights. They're going to be hated by the people that want to get rid of guns and make society safer because they can't do what those people want, and they're stuck in the middle. So there are some things that are just by design not going to be possible. And everything that's done, even if it's done exactly the way it's asked, is going to fail. And the bureaucracy is going to be the one that catches that. So the first thing you have to always do is look at what legislation is tasking the agency with. And is that even really possible? Right? Can you get there? And if the answer is you can't get from here to there, then what's the agency going to do? They're going to go as far as they can, and they know they're going to fail before they ever get started. One of the situations where this has been popping up recently, a couple of years ago, the legislature made it possible for voting boxes and voting polls to be reduced or moved around or changed. And one of the things that they did resulted, this is in Texas State, resulted in a polling place or two there that had always been there being taken away. Right? The agency had to, counties looking at it and they're like, okay, our funds are here and we've got these people here and we're only allowed to put out this many polling places this year because of the way the legislation's changed, the way funding has changed. So we got to come up with a way to try to put out polls in places that'll be best used. Well, if I'm a county clerk or staff working for a county clerk, trying to figure out where to put polling places, knowing I'm going to have to reduce them, one of the first places I'm probably going to look to reduce a polling place is a university campus or a college campus. If routinely there had been one there and now I've got to cut back, I know that I'm probably, right, I can look at my usage totals from the previous elections, but almost right off the top of my head, I'm going to tell you that age group doesn't vote, hardly ever, right? 15, 20%, right? You guys, basically, most of you. And so if I'm going to have to impact voters by reducing my polling venues, I'm going to take it away from the one that's going to impact the fewest amount of voters. Is that a winnable solution if you take that public and talk about it, that you're going to take a polling place away from a college just because you're out of money, you don't have the authority, whatever, and you're going to do that because it makes the least amount of impact? I mean, it's the best decision they got probably. But when you see a line of 2,000 students on the sidewalk waiting to vote on election day because there's not enough polling places, no one wants to know, no one cares about why there are fewer polling places than there were before. You're looking at that line and that's an indication of failure, right? It shouldn't be that long. We shouldn't have to wait like that. No one should. And that was probably the best solution possible given an impossible task, right? They're going to fail. They knew they were going to fail, and they just did what they could. Does this make sense? Am I giving you examples that are helping you understand sometimes the task you're given as a bureaucrat is not something that you can possibly be successful at? Okay. Because this is a lot of times what happens, right? The politics that plays out, the law that gets written, that has to be implemented is a law that is a loser for everybody on the business end of it, right? The people that are responsible for implementing it, as well as the people that are going to have to experience it. And there's just not much you can do about it. So if the program design is bad, if the legislation is bad, the bureaucracy is going to get nailed for this because it was them doing it, right? That happens sometimes, and it's never good when it does. And you just you grit your teeth and you say, we're bound by law to do this, and so here we go. It's almost like sorry, but right. Okay, second place where we see, and this one is huge. This one is maybe the biggest one out there. When the legislation is not clear, there's lack of clarity. So the legislation says we want X to happen. And bureaucracy, it's your job to make X happen. But the Texas Congress, the Texas legislature doesn't give you any kind of clear indication of how to get from A to Z. And you're given, as I've told you all, right, a bill passes in May or June of a legislative session, and its effective date is September 1st a lot of times. So the legislature, right, passes this law, and it basically gives you, 2 months, 3 if you're lucky, to come up with a program that will deliver on what's asked. But what is asked is nebulous. It's broad. It's kind of there, and you as a bureaucrat are left going, do they want this or this, or what exactly am I shooting for here? What's my target actually look like? And it can be something as broad as we want to reduce the number of people killed by drunk drivers on the highway, right? So that's your goal. To do that, here's money to be spent by this transportation agency on trying to make that happen. Okay, do you want me to do more unannounced full-on highway stops where we just broadly, right, do a breath test on everybody that drives through there? Do you want me to try to organize having some kind of campaign, don't drink and drive campaign? Do you want me to have some way of letting people maybe test their inebriation before they get in a vehicle, and then maybe provide state-funded taxi ride, Uber rides home or something? What do you want me to do? Any of these might work, or none of them, and you're not helping me as a legislator. You're not helping me, the bureaucrat. I'm just supposed to pick one. I'm supposed to do all the research and figure it out between now and September. Where am I going, right? I mean, we can have a piece of legislation that's we're going to reduce drunk driving fatalities by 20% in the next 2 years. But if they don't give some kind of idea of what the program is that's going to do that and what research they wanted to base that on, the bureaucracy is trying to kind of put all that together on their own. Now, it's not that they can't, right? If the legislature would give them we don't care how you do it, just see that this happens. Okay, that, maybe that's possible, right? But broad goals laid out in legislation are certainly not as bad as an impossible task, but they do leave an awful lot of room for interpretation about how you get from point A to point Z. And it's during those times that the bureaucracy is saying, boy, I really, really wish they'd have read the fiscal note I gave them on this piece of legislation when we filled it out 3 months ago, and told them that here's how we are interpreting this, and here's where we think we're going to go, and here's how much it's going to cost, and then they didn't give us that money. Although that could be a different problem that we'll get to in a little bit as well. So it's if you've ever been in a situation where you just told somebody, I need this to happen, get it done, and then they do something, and then you go, that's not what I meant, that's lack of clarity. And it happens all the time, right? Not so much, I don't think, because the legislature doesn't want to give them clear and specific goals, but a lot of times I don't think the legislature themselves necessarily is sure of how to meet of what goals will be intermediary and helping to get to the specific final goal. Any questions about lack of clarity? Does that make sense? Number 3, lack of resources. You can have a great plan, great piece of legislation, great goals, but if the legislature can't give you the tools that you need to get the job done, failure is right around the corner. And so lack of resources is always a problem, right? You don't have enough people, you don't have enough equipment, you don't have enough money, right? You don't have enough time, right? Any of those could be a resource that you're missing. You could have a goal that's very, very specific, requiring a certain level of specific throughput, and then you don't fund it or give it enough time to get it done. Here's money, here's some resources, here's some goals, but we need it done in 3 months, and we're not going to give you what we're giving you might get there in a year, but not in 3 months. If any of y'all have ever been project managers or know what project managers do as far as managing a project to completion and ensuring that everything is where it's supposed to be and the timing is all laid out and the funding is coming through, you know that there's this adage that you can have things good, cheap, or quick. Choose 2. Right? You never get all 3. Right? You don't get good, quick, and cheap. Right? And that's a lot of times the very problem that administrative bureaucracy is focused with. Right? They're given a certain amount of money, which is maybe all the state can afford. They're getting a certain amount of time because that's when it's needed to be done by. And of course, it's always supposed to be perfect. So you don't have enough resources. You don't have enough people, money, time, and yet the expectation is, right, absolute top-notch results. And it just doesn't work that way. Luckily, I'll tell you that even though this is a huge stumbling block for agencies getting their job done, luckily, most of the time, what agencies can wrangle a little more out of is time. So you go back to the legislature and you say, okay, you've given us all the money you can. We have a very clear goal of where we're going, right? Um, Given this, what you want and what you've given us, we can't do it in 2 years, or we can't do it in 6 months, or we can't, right? But given this, we can do it in this amount of time, right? But because time is value also, and so the shorter amount you have, the more costly it makes the process. Look at highway maintenance and highway building, right? And it takes years to get things done. And if you throw in a lack of resources at the same time, right? Once you start the process of ripping a road up and fixing it and laying it back down better, you can't really stop, right? I mean, that's not an option. I mean, I guess you could, but then, right, that'd be kind of bad. So you just have to keep moving at the pace you can, spending the money when you get it, fixing what you can while you've got something, and the project just takes longer, which means more inconvenience, means more upset people, but hopefully at the end of it, at least you get a result that's functional and useful. So lack of resources is always an issue, and it always will be an issue. This is nothing new or different, right? It's going to happen. It always happens. I'm sorry if you all heard that. That's me forgetting to turn my volume on my phone off. So sometimes as a bureaucrat, right, you get a new project, and it may be a project you're really interested in, you want to work, you're going to be able to do some good with it, and you see the funding, and you see the timeline, and it just kind of crushes you because you know you're going to be a failure, right? You may deliver the perfect thing that they want, but you're not going to do it either on time or on budget or something because it's just not there, right? You just don't have the resources. I can say that in the 24 years I worked for the state that I never had a project where I had everything that was necessary to finish it on time, on budget, and as expected, right? There was always something, right, that you had to do. The biggest one was one time when I was working for TCQ, we were supposed to replace, and I did a lot of IT work. We were supposed to replace what was called the central database, which was the main database that all of the licensing people were in, and their training and corporations and training. It was every piece of contact information of people that the agency worked with, through, or over was in this database. And that database was about 21 years old, had to be run on equipment that was no longer in production, that we were really just keeping running because we had good people that could fix it. And we went to the legislature and we told them, we need to replace this, right? We've got to get it on updated equipment. We've got to get it in updated computer language, right? We're tired of working in C++, and there's so much more we could do well if we could get there. And they said, okay, well, how long is it going to take to do this? And we told them it'd take about 2 years to 2.5 years. We'll need $10 million, right, to do this. And so they gave us a 2-year, like we'd asked for, and $3 million. Said, go for it. So we chopped the project into about a third as big as we'd originally had it. And we spent that money, and we went back and told them, okay, we got a third of it done, we're out of money. What happened? Well, here it is, right? And, okay, well, it took us 3 legislative sessions to get the money we needed to get the project done in the 2 years that they wanted it. It took us 6. When it was done, it worked great. But there you go, right? It failed. By all standards, that project failed because it wasn't done on time and on budget. Resources are a problem. Does that make sense? All right, let's talk about one of my favorite ways that things fail. Administrative routine. This is a human nature problem, right? Once you've trained somebody to do something, right, and they've learned that training, they've, right, really learned it well, and that they know how to do their job perfectly. You've got a bureaucrat that's going to do their job, and they're going to kick it out, and they're going to be efficient, and they're going to be effective, and that's a great thing. And then the world's going to change, and you're going to have to change their process. And that's just like the sky is falling, right? It's just, and you hear it, and you hear it, and you hear it, and people are like, well, we've always done it like this. It's always been fine. We should just keep doing it this way. It's like, no, the law has changed, or right, the world has changed, and we need to account for something else, or something's changed, and we have to change with it. And those people have right, internalized their standard operating procedures, right, to the point that they're doing things just automatically, and they're doing them right until you change what right is. And I'll give you an example. I had this lady that when I took over this section, she was fantastic. I mean, as a new manager, I was going to her all the time and saying, okay, this is what it looks like we're doing here. What am I missing? What's the problems? Right. And she was just basically mentoring me along because she'd been doing the real work for so long that she knew the answer to everything. Right. She was just stellar, fantastic. And I'm learning my job. I'm looking through all of that, and I realized that there was something we were supposed to be doing as an agency that we hadn't been doing for 2 years. We'd never done it. The law had changed, and somehow or another, the agency decided they weren't required to do that. It didn't apply to them. Something, but they weren't doing it. And I was coming in with new eyes going, man, this sure looks like we should be doing this. And what this was doing criminal history background checks on people that wanted to get a license from the state. So in other words, we were giving licenses to people like that would let them go into people's houses and install irrigation systems in their garages, or water treatment systems that would let them go into their garages and then testing them inside the house. And we were doing background checks on these people to see if they were a danger to the public, or if they had a history of assaulting people or kidnapping people or sexually assaulting people. And we were just giving them licenses that were going to put them in a situation to maybe do that again. And I'm reading through this and I'm like, we can't do this. We've got to start criminal history background checks. And I took it up the chain, and they're like, yeah, we're in trouble. We haven't been doing this. So we go back, and this lady that was my stellar employee completely understood what the problem was instrumental in helping draw up the new process to do all this, and was the biggest problem ever going forward. She understood. She was wanting to do the right job, but the way she had done it for so long had not changed, that she just kept falling back into the habit, right, of doing it this other way. And she kept forgetting and forgetting and forgetting, and became one of my problem children on that issue, right? It was one of those things like, what are you doing? And you know, she'd come to me just upset because she's like, I forgot to do this again. You know, great employee, great person, couldn't get her head around the change. Right. So once you get that uniform procedure locked in and that practice, and you've been doing it for a long time, it is so hard to break that habit when change comes along. And if you can't break that habit and learn the new process, that's a failure. Right. We ended up giving a license to a murderer. We ended up giving a license to someone that had been convicted of sexual assault because the people failed to check the background history. And so I was put in the position of having to fix that. It's never fun calling person up and telling them you're going to take their license away that gives them a livelihood, knowing that they're a murderer, and thinking, I wonder if they're going to be one again after I get done talking to them. It's an implementation fail. It's what happens, right? And it's just the human nature of people doing their jobs, that those kind of things are going to be there. And in that case, a lot of times it's actually easier to have people that haven't learned their job yet, or new hires, because you can train them in the right way. If they're still there in 10 or 15 years, something's going to change. They're going to be the problem later on. This is just the way it is, right? Administrative routine becomes habitual, becomes just the way we do it. And then when you have to change that and you upset that routine, failure. You give licenses to murderers. Now, luckily, we really did a deep dive on the murderer, and everything indicated he'd been out of jail for almost 20 years. Had done his time, had never had anything else go wrong, was actually a deacon or pastor or assistant pastor at his church, right? Everything was perfect and we rolled with it, and I didn't actually have to take it away after we got all that. But I had to make the first phone call about, hey, you're probably going to have to give up your license, because we shouldn't have probably given it to you to begin with. And then we ran it all the way up the chain and talked to legislators, and everybody was kind of like, well, it's a risk, but we're willing, and so that person actually did keep their license. But it was still an implementation failure, right? They should have been checked ahead of time and vetted ahead of time, and then had them come in and tell us what was going on before we decided to take their license away or something. All those standard operating procedures, good until they're not. Any questions about this? All right, let's talk about another good one. Implementation fails because of administrative discretion, sometimes referred to as administrative disposition, which is a particular perspective, right? So anytime you're trying to take, right, legislation, and a piece of legislation that has a focus or a goal on it, and then you try to apply it to people, it never fits perfectly. It just can't, right? Legislators and bureaucrats cannot conceive of all of the possible iterations of how people are in the world, and how legislation might impact them, or and so you're always going to have the case where if you're conscious of that issue, you try to allow for discretion, right? You try to allow for your bureaucrats to look at each situation that's coming up during a process and see how well it fits the process, and then how you can manipulate things to meet the legislative goal and deliver good service, and do well. And that means you have to give some freedom, some discretion to people that are doing the work to make their best judgment, to make a call. And anytime you give people discretion, flexibility, at some point they're going to exercise it, and a lot of people are going to disagree with it. So let's take police officers as a perfect example of a street level bureaucrat. In other words, someone that has to have flexibility to do their job well, and that flexibility can get them into a heap of trouble, or it can make you, the recipient of their discretion, right, really, really upset, or very, very happy. So you're on the interstate. You're driving down the road. The speed limit is 75, and you're making time, which means you're going 80, 84. You're flying, right? But this is Texas. We do that. And this police officer sees you fly by him at 84 and says, you know what? I need to have a conversation. So they pull you over. What are you hoping as the driver of this situation? What are you hoping about the result of this interaction with this police officer? Now let's just assume, right, it's just a traffic violation. It's just a speeding issue. There's nothing else going to be in there. It's all you're worried about, right, is right, you're either going to get a ticket for speeding, you're going to get a warning, you're hoping, or just a stern talking to, right, Jeremiah? And you're working your story over in your head, right? What story am I going to give this police officer? Because I know he has the flexibility to decide here on the spot now, stern talking to, warning, ticket. Or if you're really flying, let's go downtown. Right? You know that. You know that they have that discretion about what they do. And you're hoping that they're willing to exercise that discretion if you give them the right story, right? That's the game we play. If we're lucky and right, there's nothing else coming into it, right? The game we're playing with the police officers, can I give you the right story that will convince you to not take money away from me? Right? That's the scenario we got here. They're the bureaucrat. They're the ones that have been charged with looking after safety on the highways, which means looking after, right, the speeds that we travel and the traffic that we're in, and using their best judgment to try to make sure that behavior is within some acceptable norm. Let's say the speed limit is 75 and you're going 76 or 78, and they write you a ticket. You gonna be a little torqued off about that one? You're 3-4 miles over the speed limit, and they're writing you a ticket. Not a warning, not a please slow down, not a hey, there's an awful lot of traffic here. Could you be a little more? They're writing you a ticket. When we're in Texas and everybody knows you get 5 miles over the speed limit, they're writing you a ticket. Are they wrong? So it happened to you and you were on the wrong side of town, which means you got the ticket. If you're on the wrong side of town, you got the ticket probably, right? Yeah, we have an expectation through practice of enough flexibility there to expect probably nothing worse than a warning, right? Unless there's other circumstances, right, apply. And if you don't get what you expect out of that interaction, you don't get the hey, slow down, or here's a warning, don't let me see you doing this here again. You're an upset driver, and you may, right, be looking to go up the chain and yell at somebody. Do we got anybody here that are professional criers, professional storytellers? Right? They usually have some, right, that are just experts at looking at the situation and getting the right story, and they're going 20 over and they still get a warning, right? Not a crier, but can smooth talk like nobody. There you go. Yeah, right. I mean, that's the human interaction part, and that's all fine, right? As long as the bureaucrats are being, as a group, somewhat consistent. If there's a 5 mile an hour buffer and they all kind of wait and ticket you at 6 or 7 or 8 or higher, then we understand how that works. It's the ones that are the sticklers for the law, or the ones that have no real constraint on how far they give leeway to people, right, that cause the problems, because we don't get a kind of area that we can operate in with some kind of certainty. So street level bureaucrats that aren't consistent about how they apply the law cause us all kinds of problems, right? Now we want them to have the flexibility, because maybe, right, maybe you're in a hurry for a very good reason, right? Maybe, right, you've got somebody hurt, sick, or whatever that's needing, and you're taking them to the hospital, and you're going a little faster than you should, and you'd love for a police officer to get in front of you with lights and clear the way. And they've got the discretion to do that if they see that situation, right? So we want them to have flexibility, but we want them to use it responsibly. And when they don't, the application of the law that's supposed to be delivering safety, right? That's the idea behind these speed limits, is safe travel, right? If they get all caught up in something else besides looking at the safety of the situation, they're not going to apply the law the way it was intended, and we're going to be unhappy about that. This is something that people lean on all the time, is this idea of discretion, right? I can't tell you how many times I've had the staff of legislators call me up and say, okay, so we've got this constituent, and they were supposed to have done this kind of training by this date, and well, they're in training now, and it'll be good by the end of this week. Could you not take their license away from them? They're the only person with a license that can do this work in their water plant in this city, right? What are they asking? They're asking a bureaucrat, right, to extend a training deadline, right, to have some flexibility in when they pull a license or don't pull a license. And that's not wrong for them to ask that, right? The thing is the bureaucrat has to be cognizant of the situation enough to understand what's the point of this. The point of this is to ensure that people stay up on their training so that we have safe, clean water. They're 2 weeks late on getting their training, but they're there now. I can check on that, so they're getting it. Did they forget everything they needed to know in that 2 weeks while their license is expired and they're getting their training? No, they didn't. Would it be really kind of stupid to yank the license on that 2 week? Probably would, especially if it means no one else in that city has the license to do what work needs to be done. You're probably endangering a lot more people by yanking the license than letting these people technically keep operating while their license is expired, right? That's when we need to be able to see this flexibility do its job right, and say, okay, is this a danger? Is this a problem? Yes, it's a problem, but if we keep them there, it's not really a danger, and maybe we do something else that tries to reinforce getting their training done. Like, we'll let you keep your license, but you're going to take this class, and here's another one you need to take that we think will put you in good stead going forward, right? Something, and because you're focused on the right thing, which is the goal, and not always the letter of the law. Does that make sense? Sometimes it's hard to do that. Sometimes it's hard for a bureaucrat to pull themselves out of I'm in the enforcement phase and think about why we have the goals to begin with, right? So, but we need discretion, but the very fact that we have it means we're going to have problems. We're going to have failure. Somebody's going to make a decision. Everybody's going to look at that and go, that was really stupid. But they've got the discretion to make that decision. So right? Sometimes you have to back them up. Sometimes you have to live with it, right? And that's the way the world works. And so implementation of policy sometimes fails because we have to let people make decisions given the circumstances that they see at the time they see them. And sometimes they make good ones and sometimes they don't, right? And that's just that's human again, right? Humans make mistakes. All right, let's any questions on that? All right, so let's look at a little bit different one here. And this is failure by fragmentation. Anytime you have a complex project that requires the interaction of a lot of people, a lot of experts, over a long period of time, not everybody's going to be on the same page. Even when you got professional project managers whose job is to try to make everybody be on the same page. You throw in a little bit of discretion, you throw in a little bit of resources, and you got problems all over the place. But let me explain what the problem of fragmentation is. Any of y'all, when you were in school, like second grade or third grade or something like that, play the telephone game where you get lined up in you set up a line of chairs and everybody sits in a chair, and you tell somebody at one end a short story, and then they whisper it to the person in the chair next to them, and you pass it down the line. And the fun part, of course, is to see what story comes out at the end of the line. Sometimes it's recognizable. Sometimes it's not. And when that happens, that is a failure of fragmentation. In other words, all of those people in the chair had a responsibility to listen to the story and then tell the story right the same way they heard it. And if everybody did that perfectly, what comes out at the end is the same story. But people are different, and people understand things different. People expect different things. People do things a different way. And so what comes out the end is never, ever have I seen it come out the same. Right? It's always different. It might be recognizable, but it's always different. That, right, kind of practice or occurrence happens in the real world all the time, right? You've got a project like, a multi-million-dollar computer database project where you've got, right, project managers and business analysts and programmers and hardware folks and users, and then you've got to get a new user interface, and it's all got to come together so that you have a working piece of software at the end that does everything it used to do, plus all these new little bells and whistles you threw in on the amount of money and in the time frame you're given. And all along that way, all of those people have the opportunity to make things better, make things worse, not quite get all the attention on it they need to. It's their 12th project out of 14 that they're working on, and they'll give some time to it when they get there, right? And, can you get it done by this date? And yeah, sure, but then it's a week later, and then the next one's a week later. And did you make sure and get this little buzzer in there and this little button in there? And does it do exactly this? And did you think of exactly this? All of those little things, right? Multiplied over lots and lots of different people, all trying to do the best they can, right? We got nobody here sabotaging anything. That's the fragmentation problem that happens in every project. And implementation of legislation is a project. Every time we have to take a law and turn it into practice, into actual work, into delivering some service or product or something to people, it's a project. And you've got to have it perfectly planned and perfectly coordinated, and everybody doing exactly what they're supposed to do, when they're supposed to do it, the way they're supposed to do it, right? To try to come close to delivering what you're supposed to. And even with a bunch of really well-meaning people that are experts at what they do, it's always a struggle. Always a struggle. And it is literally what makes project managers drink. So it's an interesting job to have, to be a bureaucrat that's trying to implement legislation. It's not only interesting work, but a lot of time it's work that's delivering something that's going to help people, help them live better, help them have a better job, help them get education, help them do something, right? Ensure, maybe clean air, clean water, or who knows, right? There's most of the time legislation is intended to deliver a benefit to the people in some way. And the bureaucrat's job is to actually make it happen. While the legislature is the person that's standing up there saying, look, we passed this law and we've made this happen, it's happening. Really all they've done is say, here's what we're going to do. right? And the bureaucrat's job is to do it. And it gets very complex, and a lot of times they fail, right? Because they didn't corral all of the horses and get them going the same direction, right? And turning legislation into policy is a very difficult process, and it fails because of that. My favorite commercial is a perfect example of this. And it was a Super Bowl commercial from a long time ago, but you might remember it. It was a commercial. Well, let me tell you about the commercial, and you can tell me about what it was about if you remember. You remember the commercial where there are a bunch of cowboys on horseback, and they're herding cats, literally. Just if you replaced cattle with cats, the commercial is them, right, herding cats. And they're interviewing cowboys about doing their job. Does anybody remember this advertisement? It was a long time ago, so don't feel bad if you don't, right? It won like an award for best commercial of the year or something. It was a Super Bowl commercial. And do anybody remember who the company was that it was for? Okay. We're going to do this. This is fun. I'm gonna show it to you. It's so good. It's on YouTube, right? It's been there forever. And so we're gonna jump over real quick and watch this commercial. I think you'll get a kick out of it. And it is somewhat on topic about what's going on here. So let's see if it pops up. Okay. So I'm going to see if can I expand that. What does that look like for you guys? And let's hit play.
He's the first cat herder in our family. Herding cats. Don't let anybody tell you it's easy. Anybody can herd cattle. Holding together 10,000 half-wild short hairs, well, that's another thing altogether. Being a cat herder is probably about the toughest thing I think I've ever done.
I got this one this morning, right here. And if you look at his face, it is ripped to shreds, you know?
You see the movies, you hear the stories. I'm living a dream. Not everyone can do what we do.
I wouldn't do nothing else.
It ain't an easy job, but when you bring a herd into town and you ain't lost a one of them, ain't a feeling like it in the world.
PDS, managing the complexities of the digital economy.
So there you go, right? That's putting legislation into work, right? That's whoops, something's still running back there. Please welcome Will Ferrell. It's the work that goes on to turn legislation into policy, into practice, right, is really, really difficult. And we don't recognize sometimes how hard it is. And anybody that's ever been on the back end of a project trying to make something work understands there's usually a lot more to it than just somebody saying it's going to happen and telling somebody to do it and then it happens. Unfortunately, that's another place where we see failure, right? That's another place. And that's kind of, for me, as the commercial that catches that whole, right? I got the cats going everywhere, and Cletus over there scratched, ripped all up, and you got cat hair on you that you're having to get off with the little lint brush, and if you're lucky, you get all your cats into town, right? and that's kind of what happens on the back end of legislation. It probably almost certainly happens during the legislative process as well, right? That's a project to get an idea and turn it into a law, and then it's a brand new project to take that law and then turn it into action, right, into policy. So there's 6 of these places here that we've described where you can see policy fail, Right? You can see legislation that was handed over to the bureaucracy to be implemented. It can fail for all of these reasons or a mixture of these reasons. And as someone that's done that for a long time, has done the post-operative analysis of a failed project, right? You can see these things kind of stack up. You can see these problems: little problem here, little problem here, little problem here, failure, right? Maybe none of them were all big enough to kill it individually, but the accumulation of them does, right? So the fragmentation, right, where you got three streams of people, groups doing three different things that are supposed to arrive at the same place at the same time, and when they do, right, they're not building the same thing. So all of that is not to excuse failure, right? And it's just that we need to understand what happens and why it is that it does fail. The other side of it too is that if it were easy, a private company would do it and be profitable with it, right? Most of the problems that the legislature is charged with trying to solve, and then the bureaucracy is charged with implementing, are problems that are human problems and are behavioral problems and are resource poor problems, right? That require the ability of a government to step out of a profit-making perspective and solve a problem that has to be solved, even if it's not right one that's going to end up making a profit. There is no real case where we've seen something like environmental protection be profitable, right? In the sense that the regulation of it is going to make money for the state or going to pay for itself. It's always a sunk cost. And corporations aren't going to want to do it, right? If we were to pass a law that says any company that puts pollution into the environment has to be financially responsible for making sure that they neutralize it, we'd have a lot of companies go broke. So that's where we utilize, right, government as a way to kind of come in and try to solve these unsolvable, non-profitable problems that are very complex and take a while, and there aren't perfect answers to. And then you throw in the natural complexities of trying to organize a group of people to do something, and it's difficult. I like to look at things like one of the most efficient organizations on Earth, right, until just recently, was the U.S. Postal Service. Right, actually, it's probably still one of the most efficient organizations. It is a public corporation, right? It is supposed to operate for profit, although the U.S. Congress doesn't let it. But as a bureaucracy, right, which is what it is, its job is to deliver mail, and it delivers, right, billion pieces of mail a year or more, and it does it until the newest Postmaster General. It used to do it in 5 days or less, write a letter, standard first-class letter, get from anywhere to anywhere in the continental United States, maybe even Alaska and Hawaii, for 55 cents. 1 ounce piece of a letter could go anywhere from 55 cents. And they delivered those billion pieces a year with a 99.99% accuracy and efficiency rate. In other words, it was there where it was supposed to be, in a mailbox, in 5 days or less. Failures on the leadership side of things are starting to change that, but bureaucracies can be effective. Bureaucracies can do very complex things, and bureaucracies can do them. And until just not too long ago, the U.S. Postal Service was a very profitable public company until Congress changed the laws around it. So it can do it at a profit sometimes too. When you talk to other organizations like FedEx or UPS or DHL, they don't want to do the full job the U.S. Postal does for the price level U.S. Postal Service charges, right? You ask them, do you want to deliver letters? And they go and tell them you got to deliver it to every mailbox in the U.S. And they'll say, sure. And then you say you got to do it for 55 cents. And they're not going to happen, right? We're not going to do that. So, you know, the legislation and the project and the policy can all work, right? If things line up right. And we can look at the post office as you know, most efficient organization ever created by man, probably in the history of man. Being damaged right now by politics, which, you know, that tends to be true a lot of times. Okay, so do these 6 reasons for failure or explanations for failure make sense to you? You know, anytime I give you a list, right, of things that we're going to cover, and then we cover them, that's a pretty big hint. So make sure you got it, right? Okay. So what do we got? We got just a couple minutes here, really. And we've really only got a couple slides left. Let's call it a day, since we're going to shift topics here. And we'll talk about bureaucracy and the growth of government, both mainly at the U.S. level as a whole, because it's explanatory down to the states as well. And we'll come back and we'll do that on Monday and finish this chapter out. So Monday will be the 3rd of May, and your test is on the 4th of May and goes through this chapter, right? So we'll have basically 4 or 5 slides to cover on Monday that you'll get tested on. So there are 32 and we're on 25. So seven slides we'll cover on Monday that will be on the test on Tuesday. So, you know, we got plenty of time to knock this chapter out on Monday and be done with it. And we'll cover more, right? Monday we'll move on into the next chapter on local government. Any questions before we call it a day? Remember, office hours start at 3 o'clock, so I'll be back in the room at 3 o'clock from 3 to 4. If you've got any questions and want to pop in and say hi. Other than that, I am